Harvard engineers plan a new real-world geoengineering experiment. At a recent geoengineering conference, two Harvard engineers announced plans for a real-world climate engineering experiment beginning next year, 2018. The science of geoengineering has increasingly become a part of the public conversation around climate change and an ever-controversial topic within the scientific community. Geoengineering is a type of weather modification or climate engineering which has been researched but until recently has been considered too unpredictable to attempt on a large scale. According to 2013 congressional report, quote, "The term geoengineering describes this array of technologies that aim through large-scale and deliberate modifications of the Earth's energy balance to reduce temperatures and counteract anthropogenic climate change. Most of these technologies are at the conceptual and research stages, and their effectiveness at reducing global temperatures has yet to be proven. Moreover, very few studies have been published that document the cost, environmental effects, socio-political impacts, and legal implications of geoengineering. If geoengineering technologies were to be deployed, they are expected to have the potential to cause significant transboundary effects. In general, geoengineering technologies are categorized as either a carbon dioxide removal, CDR method, or a solar radiation management, SRM, or albedo modification method. CDR methods, that's the carbon dioxide removal methods, address the warming effects of greenhouse gases by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. CDR methods include ocean fertilization and carbon capture and sequestration. SRM methods, that's the solar radiation management, SRM methods, address climate change by increasing the reflectivity of the Earth's atmosphere or surface. Aerosol injection and space-based reflectors are examples of SRM methods. SRM methods do not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but can be deployed faster with relatively immediate global cooling results compared to CDR methods. The U.S. government's caution with geoengineering program seems to be shifting, as indicated by a new announcement related to an upcoming real-world climate engineering experiment. At the recent Forum on Solar Geoengineering Research, Harvard engineer and consistent proponent of climate engineering, David Keith, announced his plan for a new project that will assess the risks and benefits of deploying geoengineering on a large public scale. Keith and fellow engineer Frank Kuch will research the benefits and risks by spraying particles such as sulfur dioxide, alumina, or calcium carbonate from high-altitude balloons over Arizona during 2018. The move to real-world testing of geoengineering should not come as a surprise given the fact that in the final days of former President Obama's administration, the U.S. Global Change Research Program released a report detailing the path of research into climate change, including new research on geoengineering. With the release of these reports, the GCRP became the first scientists in the federal government to formally recommend studies involving geoengineering. Quote, "The move will likely further normalize discussion of deliberate tinkering with the atmosphere to cool the planet and of directly collecting carbon from the sky, both topics once verboten in the climate science community," end quote, Science magazine predicted at the time. David Keith said there will be a multi-phase plan for research and conducting real-world testing within the next 18 months. Keith also called for stratospheric spraying within 3 years and continuous spraying for at least a century. So that means that chemtrails will be 24/7 over us now. Whether we like it or not, we're going to be eating, breathing, and SHITing all this stuff in our atmosphere, whether we like it or not. And obviously, this is going to be very detrimental to our health. And it comes to mind now, what comes to mind immediately is depopulation agenda. So Keith called for stratospheric spraying within 3 years and continuous spraying for at least 100 years, for a century. And who is he to be calling that? Who's pulling the ropes here for humanity? Technology Review reports that Keith said his team is already in the process of engineering design work with Arizona test balloon company Worldview Enterprises and discussing the appropriate government structure for such an experiment. God forbid. Let's hope Trump will stop this. Quote, in terms of governance, they have distributed, there's more actors involved than we expected there would be, end quote. That's what Keith stated, and he added, there's more need to understand and to speak openly about the associated risks and what they imply for governance, end quote. The very notion of unilateral geoengineering means that other countries could face potential risks. This creates a need for new governance structures, or possibly a global government. This makes the Trump administration's support for geoengineering curious, since President Trump has been very outspoken against globalists. However, as The Guardian notes, David Schneer, an architect of Trump's Environmental Protection Agency's transition team, has lobbied the U.S. government and testified to Senate in favor of federal support for geoengineering. The Guardian also notes that while Energy Secretary Rex Tillerson was still CEO at ExxonMobil, his company was involved in developing geoengineering techniques. David Keith did note that his next move depends on what an advisory committee recommends. He says, our long-term goal is to build a sustainable effort in solar geoengineering research that allows us to say more about ways it might actually provide public benefit, end quote. Keith's experiments are publicly acknowledged as some of the earliest large-scale geoengineering experiments conducted outside of a lab or a computer model, although this view is disputed by some researchers. More on that in a moment. Despite this lack of real-world knowledge, Keith has been adamant that any environmental impacts would be negligible, he says. I beg to differ. Again, this view is disputed by geoengineering researchers. The possible dangers now of geoengineering. Most recently, in late October 2016, the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity released a report examining the problems of geoengineering and whether or not humanity will be forced to employ the practice in an attempt to halt climate change. The report, quote, update on climate geoengineering in relation to the Convention on Biological Diversity, potential impacts and regulatory framework, end quote, found that geoengineering would reduce the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and the global level, but also cause unpredictable rain and temperature distribution on the local level. I would venture to say that this is also going to be a huge endangered species result. Not only trees and animals, but especially humans. The UN report states that the effectiveness of geoengineering is uncertain, and in reducing the scale of one problem, other new problems would be created. No kidding. Thus, there would also be the risk of geoengineering action also contributing to other drivers affecting biodiversity loss and ecosystem integrity. Of course, water, air, plants, everything, and animals will be dying off. Now, Dr. Phillips Williamson, lead author of the report and scientist with the Natural Environmental Research Council in the United Kingdom, says he is skeptical of geoengineering. The UN concludes that although SRM may possibly slow the loss of Arctic sea ice, but not without unacceptable climate impacts elsewhere. One particular method of SRM involves injecting aerosols into the atmosphere via airplanes. Yes, what we call chemtrails and chemplanes. The study found that the use of sulfur aerosols for SRM would be associated with a risk of stratospheric ozone loss. There's also a risk that stratospheric aerosol injection would have a small impact on climate change, but could lead to negative impacts on biodiversity. Of course, killing off plants and animals. Anything alive, that is. In 2016, Activist Post also reported on an analysis released by the Finnish Meteorological Institute in Finland. The FMI, the Finnish Meteorological Institute, is the government agency responsible for reporting weather data and forecasts in Finland. The Institute study, quote, modeling radioactive and climate effects of aerosols, radiative and climate effects of aerosols from anthropogenic emissions to geoengineering, end quote, examines the potential for SRM to combat climate change. The study specifically looked at two types of SRM. The first involved marine aerosol concentration used to increase clouds, while the second looked at increasing the amount of sulfur concentrated in the stratosphere. The researchers stated that their key objectives were to investigate the potential of aerosols to cool the climate at the global scale and identify the possible limits in the effectiveness of the solar radiation management techniques, as well as the risks related to these techniques. The researchers found that the geoengineering techniques which were studied do in fact have the potential to cool the climate and slow down warming. However, the cooling effect has limitations. The team writes, the cooling effect attributable to aerosols would be rather small due to the geographical change in tropospheric aerosol emissions or change in energy production studied here when compared to the warming due to the increased greenhouse gas emissions, the paper states. In other words, the effort, money, and time it would take to invest and create geoengineering methods would likely do very little to actually limit the amount of greenhouse gas emissions. The researchers even state that, based on their models, if the world replaced coal with nuclear power for energy production, it would lead to a temporal cooling effect. But after several years, the warming effect from simultaneously increased GHG emission would increase the cooling effect. Also, would exceed the cooling effect. Also, the cooling that does result from an increase in aerosols is often achieved at the cost of air quality, which could lead to an increase in premature mortality. No kidding! Oh, well, let's cool off the weather, but kill off everything else. What can I say? In February 2015, an international committee of scientists released a report stating that geoengineering techniques are not a viable alternative to reducing greenhouse gas emissions to combat the effects of climate change. The committee reported calling for further research and understanding of various geoengineering techniques, including carbon dioxide removal schemes and solar radiation management before implementation. The scientists found that SRM techniques are likely to present serious known and possible unknown environmental, social, and political risks, including the possibility of being deployed unilaterally. The report was sponsored by the National Academics of Science, the U.S. Intelligence Community, NASA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the U.S. Department of Energy. According to a 2013 study published by the journal Geophysics Research, Atmospheres, if geoengineering programs were started and then suddenly halted, the planet could see an immediate rise in temperatures, particularly over land. The study, titled The Impact of Abrupt Suspension of Solar Radiation Management, seems to indicate that once geoengineering begins, the programs cannot be suspended without causing the very problem the engineering was intended to solve. Geoengineering to save humanity, or something more nefarious? There's also a dispute among many researchers as to whether geoengineering programs are already active. What the geoengineering researchers describe, specifically spraying aerosols from planes as SRM describes, is eerily reminiscent of various conspiracies involving the government using weather control technology to manipulate world events. This is what is derogatorily called the chemtrail conspiracy. Conspiracy called derogatorily. Essentially, some believe geoengineering is actively taking place in our skies. Yes, it is. We've all seen it worldwide. They say the contrails you see behind planes are actually geoengineering programs being carried out covertly. The chemtrails label comes from the portion of the crowd that believes these programs are delivering dangerous chemicals, additives to the food, water, and soil, and humans below for population control. Despite the knee-jerk dismissal from many casual researchers, the theories might be grounded in reality. It's important to know that the United States government has a history of weather modification. In 1996, a document entitled Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owing the Weather by 2025, the U.S. Air Force discussed a number of proposals for using weather as a weapon. The Air Force document was not the first time the U.S. military mentioned weather weapons. The New York Times piece from June 15, 1947, quotes General George C. Kenney, commander of the Strategic Air Command, as saying, quote, "The nation that first learns to plot the path of air masses accurately and learns to control the time and place of precipitation will dominate the globe," end quote. And it is these fears of weather as a weapon which lead the United States and other nations to sign the Environmental Modification Treaty, which called for halting global weather modification. But the government did not simply research these ideas. It actually implemented them. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. government operated covert weather modification programs under Operation Popeye. In 2012, it was also revealed that the U.S. Army sprayed toxic chemicals over the skies of St. Louis without informing the public. In February 2015, while speaking at an annual meeting of the American Association for Advancement of Science in San Jose, California, Professor Alan Robach discussed the possibility that the CIA is using the weather as a weapon of war. Robach has done research for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the past. His theory that the CIA was using weather as a weapon of war was later proven somewhat correct when the CIA discussed weather modification. Obviously, the fact that the U.S. has researched weather modification in the past does not necessarily indicate that the technology is still in use. However, when considering all of the evidence, historical documentation, actual implementation of technology via geoengineering and cloud seeding, the visual confirmation of spraying from planes, one can start to make an educated judgment. We know that the U.S. government and other governments have studied and researched weather modification for over 100 years. We also know they've written about using the weather as a weapon of war. Based on the government's pattern of lying and concealing technologies from the public, is it that difficult to imagine that they could be secretly testing out geoengineering programs already? Finally, we know that proponents of geoengineering claim to want to fight global climate change. Even with the wealth of studies warning about the potential pitfalls, these scientists push forward. One might assume they have either lost their hubris or intentionally ignoring the evidence. If we consider the possibility that they are ignoring the evidence and lying, we must ask why they are lying and ignoring the evidence. This leads me to the darkest corner of the geoengineering conspiracy. Who is funding geoengineering and why? Those who believe that geoengineering is secretly taking place tend to divide into two camps. Those who believe the programs are being managed by overzealous scientists who want to help humanity, and those who believe geoengineering is a method of population control. The second group tends to point to the sources of funding for these projects. By studying the funding, the organizations involved, and the philosophies of the individuals behind the organizations, these researchers hope to understand the true motivations for seemingly illogical choices. It's interesting that during the conference, David Keith stated that geoengineering is receiving funding from other sources who are bringing in newer resources for significant new projects. He does not specifically mention who these other sources are, but the funding for the initial experiments would come from Harvard grants with possible additional funds from Harvard's Solar Geoengineering Research Program. The program has raised more than $7 million from Microsoft co-owner Bill Gates and the Hewlett Foundation and Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Harvard Internal Funds, and other philanthropists. The Forum on Solar Geoengineering Research was sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and funded through a generous grant by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The appearance of Bill Gates is likely to set off radars due to his involvement with the promotion of vaccines and sterilizations, another tool for population control. There's also plenty of documentation regarding the Carnegie family and their foundations covertly working against the freedom and health of the people. It also should be noted that Carnegie Science recently released a study claiming to debunk the possibility of covert spraying programs. There is also the Alfred P. Sloan involvement with the Nazi regime and in support of eugenics, which should also set off alarms. A Washington Post article from 1998 reports, quote, "Documents show that the parent company is following a conscious strategy of continuing to do business with the Nazi regime rather than divest themselves of their German assets. Less than 3 weeks after the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, GM chairman Alfred P. Sloan defended his strategy to sound business practice, given the fact that the company's German operations were highly profitable. The internal politics of Nazi Germany should not be considered the business of management of General Motors." This is what Sloan explained in a letter to concerned shareholders dated April 6, 1939. Quote, "We must conduct ourselves in Germany as a German organization. We have no right to shut down the plant." End quote. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation was formed to honor Sloan. According to their website, the Sloan Foundation believes that a carefully reasoned and systematic understanding of the forces of nature and society, when applied inventively and wisely, can lead to a better world for all. The current president of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation is Dr. Paul Josky, a Yale University graduate, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and current advisor for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This puts JOSCO right in the middle of a number of organizations involved with promoting global governance. It also is curious that JOSCO is both an advisor to Trump's EPA and the head of an organization investing in geoengineering research. This seems like an indicator that the Trump administration will support further research. One last interesting note relates to a recent letter from the San Diego Union Tribune editorial board. The board condemned President Trump for working against Obama-era environmental regulations and then called for billionaires to invest in private geoengineering research. Quote, "The San Diego Union Tribune editorial board can't be alone in thinking a hedge against catastrophe makes common sense. We call on one or more of the nation's benevolent billionaires to consider privately funding a massive endeavor on the scale of the Manhattan Project to try to geoengineer such a hedge. People buy life insurance every day. Earth needs life insurance too, especially when the most powerful man on it is indifferent to an existential threat to humanity." The board's choice of words was provocative when you consider that researchers Peter Kirby has been reporting that the origins of the modern-day weather modification program lies in the Manhattan Project, the infamous secret project that created the atomic bomb. Is it truly possible that the U.S. government and other nations are covertly testing out climate engineering technology? Whether to combat climate change or to poison the masses, this topic deserves the public's attention. If the people behind these programs succeed in public trials, they will begin the process of normalizing climate engineering and spraying the skies. After spending years denying that the technology or the programs existed, they will slowly test them out within the view of the public. And before we know it, this technology will be commonplace, and questioning the potential danger will be as unwelcome as questioning the safety and efficiency of vaccines. Please do your part to share this. Tell people far and wide. This is by Derek Bose on The Daily Sheeple. Harvard engineers plan a new real-world geoengineering experiment. At a recent geoengineering conference, 2 Harvard engineers announced plans for a real-world climate engineering experiment beginning next year, 2018. The science of geoengineering has increasingly become a part of the public conversation around climate change and an ever-controversial topic within the scientific community. Geoengineering is a type of weather modification or climate engineering which has been researched but until recently has been considered too unpredictable to attempt on large scale. According to 2013 congressional report, quote, "The term geoengineering describes this array of technologies that aim, through large-scale and deliberate modifications of the Earth's energy balance, to reduce temperatures and counteract anthropogenic climate change. Most of these technologies are at the conceptual and research stages, and their effectiveness at reducing global temperatures has yet to be proven. Moreover, very few studies have been published that document the cost, environmental effects, socio-political impacts, and legal implications of geoengineering. If geoengineering technologies were to be deployed, they are expected to have the potential to cause significant transboundary effects. In general, geoengineering technologies are categorized as either a carbon dioxide removal, CDR method, or a solar radiation management, SRM, or albedo modification method. CDR methods, that's the carbon dioxide removal methods, address the warming effects of greenhouse gases by removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. CDR methods include ocean fertilization and carbon capture and sequestration. SRM methods, that's the solar radiation management, SRM methods, address climate change by increasing the reflectivity of the Earth's atmosphere or surface. Aerosol injection and space-based reflectors are examples of SRM methods. SRM methods do not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but can be deployed faster with relatively immediate global cooling results compared to CDR methods. The U.S. government's caution with geoengineering programs seems to be shifting, as indicated by a new announcement related to an upcoming real-world climate engineering experiment. At the recent Forum on Solar Geoengineering Research, Harvard engineer and consistent proponent of climate engineering, David Keith, announced his plan for a new project that will assess the risks and benefits of deploying geoengineering on a large public scale. Keith and fellow engineer Frank Kuch will research the benefits and risks by spraying particles such as sulfur dioxide, alumina, or calcium carbonate from high-altitude balloons over Arizona during 2018. The move to real-world testing of geoengineering should not come as a surprise given the fact that in the final days of former